For the latest on the crisis in Syria and the U.S. response, please stay tuned to this station and Fox News Channel. And that's it for today. Have a great week, and we'll see you next Fox News Sunday.
Previously on Legends and Lies.
If war with the federal government is the result, then so be it.
One section of this country believes slavery to be right. The other believes it to be wrong. That's where the fight is here.
You stay with me, Thomas, and I promise you'll be free.
Robert E. Lee is in Maryland.
The man is going to be the death of us.
But there is no reason why the Negro is not intact. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
You promised to preserve the Union as it was, not to eliminate slavery.
It is the 4th of July, the birth date of your nation's independence. Your fathers staked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the cause of their country. But my business is with the present. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? There's not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than those of the people of these United States. The existence of slavery is the only thing that seriously threatens your union, and yet you cling to it. For the love of God, tear away. Fling from yourself this hideous monster, and let the weight of 20 million crush and destroy it forever.
A political conflict cracks the foundation of a fragile union, dividing a young nation over the issues of freedom, slavery, and equality. In a brutal battle of attrition, heroes will rise, cities will fall, and the blood of thousands will stain the land. America's struggle for life, liberty, and justice for all becomes the Civil War. Frederick Douglass, a self-determined man and former slave, an author, orator, and activist, waging political war against the president for the freedom of an enslaved people. But behind every activist stands a man, and behind every legend lies the truth.
How you doing, brother? All right. Well, how's y'all's boy? He's doing good? Okay.
For Frederick Douglass, the Emancipation Proclamation is the culmination of his lifelong struggle, from bondage to the promise of freedom. But the path to the emancipation is not as definite as many might think.
I suppose the time is now.
Throughout the war, President Lincoln maintains the conflict is only about preserving the Union, not eradicating slavery. But mounting losses on the battlefield and continued pressure from Douglass have forced Lincoln to consider issuing a final measure to save his broken Union.
Honest Abe lied to us.
Patience. Give the man some time.
As brutal as it is, Douglass still sees the war as America's best chance to rid itself of slavery. But the pressure he puts on the conflicted president has had little effect. and the cost of Lincoln's indecision is being felt on the battlefield. After a series of demoralizing defeats, many Union soldiers struggle to make sense of the bloodshed.
That man is a captain in the Union Army. Treat him with some respect.
Robert Gould Shaw, a Massachusetts regimental officer, he's coming face to face with the human cost of war. And so he's wondering, what's the point of all this carnage? What's the point of all this suffering? Are these men going to die in vain?
Mutilating corpses, Shaw?
Mothers need something to remember their sons by. What the hell are they all dying for? These deaths should mean something more. They have to.
People like Shaw begin to think, well, this war, in order to be meaningful, in order to be something that was worth fighting, has to achieve fundamental change in American society, and that fundamental change would be the destruction of slavery.
All summer long, Confederate General Robert E. Lee has chased the Yankees out of the South.
Dispatch these orders promptly.
Now, he plans to take the fight north to enemy soil and deliver a final blow that could end the war and any hope of emancipation.
Two U.S. Army soldiers find a copy of Robert E. Lee's Special Order 191. It's wrapped around 3 cigars, and it details the fact that Lee had divided his force. What this indicated is that the two forces could be separately isolated and then overpowered if McClellan acted quickly enough.
Change of plans.
McClellan now holds key battle plans that can ensure his army's success and personal redemption. It's a victory that would allow Lincoln to redefine the war, giving soldiers like Robert Gould Shaw a reason to fight and create the new America Frederick Douglass has hoped for.
There is a great deal of excitement for the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Saving the Union and emancipation are one. This game-changing event, but there was a belief that Lincoln might not do it.
Father, what if Lincoln doesn't sign the proclamation?
Then we keep fighting. I haven't come this far to watch this nation fall back into a slave-holding power.
The Emancipation Proclamation promises to make the war a fight to eradicate slavery. But that's a war Frederick Douglass has been waging his entire life.
I left my chains and succeeded in reaching New York. Now, how I did so, I must leave unexplained. But there I was, in the midst of thousands, afraid to speak to anyone, for fear of falling into the hands of those money-loving kidnappers, whose business it was to lie in wait for the fugitive. I saw in every white man an enemy, and almost every colored man a means for distrust.
Frederick Douglass is constantly reinventing himself, quite literally. He is born into slavery. He then liberates himself. He becomes an abolitionist. Douglass is trotted before white audiences by William Lloyd Garrison as the person who bears the marks of slavery on his person. And then he is asked to speak and to tell his story.
I spent my first night on the wharf. It was cold, but nothing compared to my days in Old Master's house.
Be silent!
Now, gentlemen, if you take issue with today's lecture,
The idea that the North was on the side of virtue and the South was where all the races were located, that's wrong.
Though
Frederick Douglass escapes to the North in the search of freedom, he's still a fugitive from the law. Many white Northerners at the time, particularly members of the Democratic Party, do not believe in black equality. They too fear the consequences of emancipating the slaves. Douglass realizes this. He knows that as long as slavery is legal in any part of the country, his freedom and the freedom of all African Americans will always be in jeopardy.
After years of telling his story to sometimes hostile crowds, Douglass writes an autobiography to reach a wider audience. It becomes a bestseller, making him the most famous black man in America.
There is disbelief that a black man could possibly have written his own story, let alone to have written it in such an articulate and incendiary way. And astonishingly, he's named the names of the people who abused him, and it creates terrific danger for him.
Mr. Douglass!
You're being followed. Frederick Douglass was not free as a fugitive. If he gets caught, he will then be sold to a deep southern plantation down there in Mississippi or Alabama, and life down there was absolutely horrific.
To escape capture, he set sail across the Atlantic Ocean to England, hoping to remain anonymous.
Douglass did go abroad because he was really afraid that his master would come seeking him out. Douglass also went to England to connect with British abolitionists and get their support of abolition in the United States. And because people knew of him and knew of his writings, he had a great audience waiting for him.
Mr. Douglass.
Yes.
Please come in.
Thank you.
You there. This is Mr. Douglass.
Douglass, for the first time, there doesn't appear to be any prejudice to which he is subjected, and contemplates staying in England because he's not subject to what he sees as the hypocrisy of the North.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you.
Come in, please.
No, thank you.
We have to remember that in Britain, slavery has been outlawed since the 13th century. So he has a vision of a kind of freedom that he might enjoy. So he decides to return and fight for something like that in America.
The Emancipation Proclamation could help bring about the freedom Frederick Douglass has worked for. But it all depends on a president who has done everything he can to avoid making the Civil War about slavery.
Mr. President, is anything the matter?
As the Union body count rises, soldiers are growing weary of the fight.
What the hell are they all dying for?
Men like Robert Gould Shaw and Frederick Douglass carry the burden of a nation, while they wait on the president to give a new meaning to the war.
Son, we've waited for Lincoln this long. We can wait a little while longer.
It's been 100 days. That's plenty of time for Lincoln to change his mind.
Word is leaked that the president is going to make a big announcement about emancipation, but Frederick Douglass isn't sure of that. He continues to doubt Lincoln's resolve for the cause.
Mr. President, is anything the matter?
I just need a moment.
The Emancipation Proclamation is the result of a nearly 2-year-long battle to define what the Civil War means to the soldiers in uniform, to over 3 million enslaved African Americans, and to Lincoln himself. When Lincoln takes office, he tries to prevent the looming Civil War by reaffirming his belief in the South's constitutional right to own slaves.
What about this part? I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists.
No, that's good. Remind the South that your position on slavery has remained unchanging.
William Seward had been a political rival of Abraham Lincoln's, and yet he selected Seward as his Secretary of State. Seward was certainly more of a passionate abolitionist than Lincoln. I don't believe Lincoln saw himself truly as the president that was going to end slavery. His mission at that point was to reunite the country.
If they fear that you wish to start a war to take their slaves away, you should remind the South that those fears are unfounded.
Once the war starts, enslaved African Americans see it for what it truly is, a chance to be free. Fort Monroe is a Union outpost in Confederate territory, defended by 4,500 men, including a Zouave regiment, and commanded by General Benjamin Butler.
General Butler, fugitive slaves captured just outside the fort.
Please, sir. We're just looking for safe harbor. We've escaped Colonel Mallory and the Confederate Army.
I see. The three men that come in to Butler, they happen to come in after Virginia votes to secede. They don't come in the day before, because if they come in the day before, Virginia is not a Confederate state, not a secessionist state.
Virginia claims she's no longer part of our Union. I suppose the law no longer holds water. These men ought to be considered contraband of war.
Butler understood that white Southerners saw their slaves as property. And since they were being used to support the Confederate war effort, their capture, their seizure, and their retention was well within the laws of war.
Please, make yourself comfortable.
Right this way, boys.
Congress approved of what Butler had done. They liked that solution. In August 1861, they passed a Confiscation Act. From there on in, escaped slaves, then were called contrabands.
Does this mean that we're free?
That's not my part to say. It's for the president.
Despite his rank, Benjamin Butler has no strategic military experience and is considered a disaster on the battlefield. But his tenacity as a lawyer and deft political mind allow him to identify escaped slaves as contrabands of war. Butler's controversial decision would eventually inspire thousands of slaves to cross Union lines, creating a path for Lincoln to entertain the idea of emancipation.
Butler's Fort Monroe Doctrine has an immediate impact on the Confederacy. When the Union Navy invades South Carolina's Sea Islands, plantation owners leave behind 10,000 slaves. These new contrabands begin to grow and harvest cotton and other crops for the Union, and teachers from the North come to Port Royal to educate them.
We did more than Patrick Henry.
You seem to be taking in the letters real quick, General.
Once a man has knowledge, he'll not be satisfied unless he also has freedom. I want you to draft an order. If the president is too timid to make a stand, then I will.
Emancipation was happening in the Civil War well before the Emancipation Proclamation. Generals in the South, like David Hunter, actually issued their own emancipation proclamations in the territory they controlled. This panicked the White House and the Lincoln administration.
Any news, Father?
No good news. General Hunter has taken it upon himself to emancipate the contraband in Port Royal.
Is this really bad news, Mr. President? Elizabeth is right.
Elizabeth Keckley emerged as the favored seamstress of women of power. When Mary Todd Lincoln came to town, she went to the most popular seamstress in Washington. And Elizabeth Keckley became quite a confidant and established a contraband relief society. And Mary Todd Lincoln became rather active in this organization.
Isn't freedom the next logical step for the contrabands?
It is.
Preserving the Union was Lincoln's paramount priority. And certainly that was true at the beginning of the war. And he pushed the issue of slavery down the line about as far as it could go until his hand was forced.
Emancipating slaves is not a decision for a general to make. It's a decision for the president. I cannot emancipate the slaves.
Elizabeth, careful with those pins. Sorry, madam. It must have slipped.
Lincoln immediately rescinds General Hunter's orders out of fear that he might lose the support of Northern Democrats and crucial border states like Maryland. So in fact, what you have is the president re-enslaving people. But Lincoln firmly believes that the only way to end slavery and save the Union is for emancipation to become a reality in accordance with the Constitution. So now he's walking a political tightrope between anti-abolition Northerners and abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass, who view the president's actions as cowardice.
Gentlemen, our nation is on fire. And the only choice, the only option we have left is abolition or destruction.
Time for action is now.
Robert E. Lee's Confederates are more than willing to die for the rebel cause.
Prepare for the enemy advance.
But Union troops are beginning to lose faith. Despite pressure from his own generals to emancipate the slaves, Lincoln still refuses to act, forcing Frederick Douglass to escalate his war of words.
President Lincoln has repeatedly interfered with the anti-slavery policies of some of his most earnest and reliable generals. But he can never put back the scattered pieces of this Union into the shape and form of which they stood before this slaveholding rebellion.
Douglass built up a rage against those who would defend and spread the atrocities of slavery. But he feels the pressure to be an example of peaceful protest. Douglass works hard to reconcile the duality. So he transformed his rage into prose and uses his sharp intellect and eloquent speech to deliver his message in a way the president and the rest of America can no longer ignore.
Gentlemen, can you not see our nation is on fire? And the only choice is abolition or destruction.
The only choice we have left is abolition or destruction.
We must abolish slavery or abandon this union.
We must abolish slavery.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
When you start reading Douglass in the newspaper, you see that he is now endorsing physical force and political activity.
For Douglass, blacks needed to fight for themselves. Fighting for their own freedom would send a message not only to the nation, but to the world.
The time for action is now. So what say you?
Douglass's hopes for emancipation are slipping away because the North isn't just losing the war, it's also being torn apart from the inside by racial animosity.
Oi! You contraband! Ain't your master looking for you?
You have a problem? Talk to the foreman.
Working-class Irish immigrants and other northern whites see emancipation as a threat to their livelihoods. If they turn against the president and the war, it could be catastrophic for the Union.
Bring up your mare!
With the Union on the verge of collapse, Robert E. Lee invades Maryland, hoping to incite a rebellion and possibly launch major attacks on cities throughout the North, including Washington. Lincoln must give the Union cause greater meaning if he's to have any hope of winning the war.
Pardon, sir.
Please come in. You had a son that died too, didn't you?
My George was killed a year ago.
So many sons have died in this war.
George's father was a white man. Not by my choice. But it did enable him to pass as white, and he enlisted in the army. I hear he fought bravely. Sir, the black man is willing to fight. And any man fighting for his freedom can bear the strength of 10 men. You just have to let him.
Lincoln is caught between his desire to end slavery and his need to keep anti-abolition Northerners on his side. Whatever step Lincoln takes, it must be in accordance with the Constitution if it's to have any chance of success.
Congress passes two very important pieces of legislation. One is the Militia Act of 1862 that gave President Lincoln the authority to bring men of African descent into the federal army. Another important piece of legislation was on his desk. It is referred to as the Second Confiscation Act. Congress declared forever free all persons held as slaves by supporters of the rebellion. He now had the legislation from which to base the Emancipation Proclamation.
Do you disapprove?
It is the timing that is my main concern. It would be better if we wait until the North wins a decisive military victory.
The wisdom of the view of the Secretary of State struck me with very great force. The result was that I put the draft of the proclamation aside, waiting for a victory.
On the heels of a crushing defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run, Abraham Lincoln realizes that if he issues a proclamation now, it would appear as a desperate measure of an embattled Union. He would also risk losing the key border state of Maryland, still divided on the issue of slavery. Now, Frederick Douglass only sees the president's inaction as an insult to abolitionists and is publicly critical. However, what Douglass doesn't know is Lincoln is just one step away from issuing a proclamation that will change.
Frederick Douglass's struggle to abolish slavery now hinges on Abraham Lincoln's willingness to change the course of the Civil War.
All persons held as slaves shall be then forever free.
All that stands in the way of emancipation is the daunting task of defeating Robert E. Lee on the field of battle.
When Robert E. Lee goes into Maryland, and it's a rather audacious move because it's crossing the Potomac River for the first time and going into Union territory.
Lee has made a plan of attack and divided his force, with one element around Hagerstown, Maryland, and the other element around Harper's Ferry in what we call West Virginia today.
Until now, top Union General George McClellan has failed to give Lincoln the victory he needs. But a lost copy of Lee's entire battle plan winds up in McClellan's hands, giving him one last shot at redemption.
If I can't whip Bobby Lee with this paper, I'll be willing to go home.
Even with General Lee's battle plan in his possession, McClellan hesitates to attack the rebel army. Many feel it's due to his fear of being outnumbered. There are others, like Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who strongly believe McClellan is a traitor. Whatever the reason, Lee has time to dig in, setting the stage for Antietam, one of the Civil War's bloodiest battles.
The fight begins at dawn as Union General Joe Hooker's troops attack Stonewall Jackson's Confederate corps.
The Southern Army has drawn up in a defensive position, running roughly from a cornfield in the north down to some high ground in the south. And McClellan throws his army at Lee's northern flank. And you've got these two armies absolutely throwing themselves at each other.
The battle-hardened rebels throw back the Union's first wave. To the north, Robert Gould Shaw and the 2nd Massachusetts prepare to enter the fray.
What's this? A letter from my mother in Boston.
If I should fall, Shaw, I want you to see that she gets it.
It won't come to that, Dwight.
Second Massachusetts, forward!
Americans had not seen so many of their fellow countrymen dead and wounded on a battlefield. All the bodies. It just staggered them.
Shaw and his men pushed through the Confederate line.
Retreat!
But Lee's outmanned rebel army refuses to quit. If McClellan can't find a way to turn this massacre into a victory, the war and any hope for emancipation will be lost.
We hit the door at 110 miles an hour every morning. And if we're not moving at that speed, our colleagues will fly right by us.
Our job is to facilitate smart conversations so that the people who are watching us can better understand what's happening in the world.
To go deeper, to find a different question that other people are not asking. That's the real challenge.
To give it to you straight, bad or good, like it or not, deliver the news.
With the Emancipation Proclamation hanging in the balance, George McClellan's Union Army clashes with Robert E. Lee's Confederate force in the Battle of Antietam.
The second phase of the Battle of Antietam is massive Union attack right at the heart of the Southern lines. And that's where the Bloody Lane occurs, when you've got this sunken road that's absolutely filled with casualties and running with blood.
After hours of savage fighting, the Union forces finally break through the center of the Confederate line. McClellan now has a chance to claim victory. All he has to do is send in his 20,000 reserve troops.
We have it by the throat, General. We could send in the reserve and finish them.
What do we know of Lee's reinforcements?
George McClellan always worried a little too much about what the enemy might do.
I will not send more men to die unless I have to, General Franklin.
And that's what happens at Antietam. Several times subordinates urge him, now is the time to launch that final blow. But McClellan's always thinking, what if things go wrong?
Just as he fails to act after intercepting Lee's battle plan, McClellan again hesitates.
Despite the fact that he overwhelmingly outnumbers Lee's force, McClellan doesn't destroy Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, and he is widely criticized for this, and particularly Abraham Lincoln was deeply disappointed. However, McClellan halts Robert E. Lee's invasion of Maryland. The entire effort collapses, men retreat back, and the attack has turned to naught.
It's all right. It's all right.
The Battle at Antietam represents the single bloodiest day in American military history. More casualties that single day than in any other battle in any other war at any other time.
Pardon me, miss. Any chance have you come across a welder, Dwight?
A few more wounded just arrived today. Over there.
Dwight? Dwight? It's me.
Seeing the carnage that the war has wrought, Robert Gould Shaw is having difficulty justifying fighting to preserve the Union. It's not a cause that people can rally behind in an emotional way, and something needs to be done to reframe the issue, to make it a moral issue, to make it about liberty versus slavery.
Antietam has the qualities of the kind of victory Lincoln needed. It was an enormous battle. It was on northern soil, and Lee had retreated.
If the rebelling states do not rejoin the Union by January 1st, their slaves will be free.
The Emancipation Proclamation promises to change the course of the war and the future of slavery in America. But what many fail to realize is that the proclamation is not a law. It's a war measure designed to weaken the Confederacy. And while it lays the groundwork for an eventual constitutional amendment abolishing slavery, it does not immediately free the slaves. In fact, it only applies to slaves in states choosing to persist in the rebellion. And slaves in border states like Maryland or Missouri remain enslaved.
With this bold war measure, Lincoln gives the South an ultimatum. If they don't lay down their arms and rejoin the Union in 3 months, their slaves will be free. But the rebels would rather keep fighting than give in to the president.
Son, the president may be slow, but he is sure. Once he stakes his claim, he won't retreat from it.
Yes, Father. The South can no longer pretend to be fighting for anything but the preservation of slavery. But with many Northerners refusing to fight for abolition, emancipation promises to either end the war or the Union.